The Psychedelic Report.
Psychedelic drugs
have played their part in America's long, strange trip toward an understanding of mind-altering drugs.
The Psychedelic News.
Leading physicians, scientists, and experts share their wisdom about psychedelic medicines and healing.
50 years ago, psychedelic drugs were at the center of America's counterculture.
The brightest minds in psychedelic medicine. The Psychedelic Report.
We use the ketamine-assisted psychotherapy model that happens to have psychedelic effects that were not predicted when the drug was first developed.
From researchers to investors.
I think the biggest mistake we've made as a culture is the war on drugs.
To physicians to shamans and nonprofit pioneers.
Psychedelic drugs.
Recent research suggests some of them could have legitimate uses.
The Psychedelic News
brings you diverse perspectives from the front lines of this exciting movement. The Psychedelic Report.
The Psychedelic Report was brought to you by Apollo Neuroscience and produced by Future Medicine Media. Welcome to the Psychedelic Report, your single source of truth for the psychedelic news. I'm your host, Dr. Dave Rabin. I'm a neuroscientist and psychiatrist trained in ketamine-assisted psychotherapy as well as MDMA-assisted therapy. We are so excited to bring you this conversation with Luke Story today. Luke, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Oh man, I'm so glad to be here. It's such a perfect opportunity in space and time to have this particular conversation right now. I'm enjoying the timing of this immensely.
And for those who don't know Luke yet, Luke has a very interesting history. I can sum things up, but Luke, would you mind giving everyone a little bit of a background about you and sort of your journey along the way, and then we can dive in deeper after that?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll see if I can rally a few brain cells to make it concise, because I'm 50 years into the journey at this point. So the story keeps getting longer, but essentially the crux of it to serve this particular conversation would be a kid that grew up in a situation in which there was a considerable amount of trauma and neglect and abandonment and also love and great things as well. I always like to add, especially if my parents ever hear any of the content, they're like, wait, what? We weren't that bad. But as a result, I started using illicit drugs at a really young age, 8,
Where
9.
Where did you grow up?
Well, I like to say I'm still in the process of growing up, but when I was a kid, I resided in Northern California in Sonoma County. That's where my mom lived. And then my dad has always lived in Colorado. And so I kind of went between the two. But really, for the most part, as a kid, I lived in California most of the time, apart from a brief sojourn at a therapeutic reform school in northern Idaho when I was 14, which came as a result of the aforementioned drug abuse and crime and different things that I got into as a result of, lacking coping mechanisms or the proper support to hold and contextualize some of the experiences that I encountered as a kid. So fast forward through that rough childhood and adolescence. And then I moved to Hollywood when I was 19. And that would have been, 32 years ago or so, if my math is right. And just fully immersed into the music scene here in the early 90s and, got further into drugs and finally had access to drugs that really served their purpose to just completely check me out. And the consequences and side effects of that coping method really started to turn very dark by the time I was 25, 26. And eventually I checked myself into a treatment center with the assistance of my lovely mom. And thus began my journey some almost 24 years ago of finally surrendering to the cold, hard fact that the consequences of coping with discomfort outweighed the benefits. And I had a really deep surrender and had a pretty profound yet ambiguous spiritual experience in a treatment center, in that I think I hit a big enough bottom that I really was able to summon a good dose of humility. And I just prayed to God. That's all they gave me. I said, hey, can I get some Dilaudid? And they said, no, you're fine. We took your vitals and you don't need any drugs. What you need is God, And so they instructed me to go in my room and pray. And that's what I did. And, I've been struck sober ever since, which is really still to me quite miraculous. And that was the gateway that opened really the rest of my life. It truly was a rebirth of sorts. And I deeply availed myself in a very committed way to, the 12-step program of recovery in its various forms. And And also, going to India and learning to meditate and practicing Kundalini yoga and really just committing spiritually, mentally, emotionally to healing and recovering as deeply as possible. And along the way, also learning quite early on that I had become so toxic as a result of living that lifestyle that I got into, alternative healing and the things that we now call biohacking, which in the 90s equated to lots of colonics, infrared saunas, herbalism, making your own kombucha, the stuff that was kind of in vogue then, superfood smoothies, medicinal mushrooms, all the entry-level stuff. And I was really able to get healthier physically, and that helped to facilitate the vitality that was needed to really recover spiritually and get very serious about that. And so along the way, I became a fashion stylist for 17 years and dressed celebrities in Hollywood, which is just some sort of random thing that I fell into and didn't fall out of for a very long time. And then 5 years ago, I just had this nagging, I don't want to say pain, that would be overstating it, but just a nagging sense that my life could have a bit more purpose and that perhaps I could take the service element of my life that had been relegated to recovery circles and expand on that and start to share some of the amazing things that I'd learned about the body, mind, spirit potential of healing. And so I started my podcast, The Lifestylist, in 2016. And that really took hold in a pretty meaningful way. And that has availed me opportunities to do a lot of public speaking and various online programs and all the things that people like us kind of do in the content creation space. And so now what I think was the most meaningful, and in the context of this conversation, was that 22 years of sobriety, I finally just had to heed the call of plant medicines. And I went to Costa Rica and did 4 ayahuasca ceremonies. And it just completely, as anyone listening, I'm sure could attest to in their own way, just completely transformed my entire life and also my relationship to recovery, sobriety, etc. And so over the past couple of years, I've really been integrating quite a lot of that exploration and discovering the complexities and the nuances of that type of spiritual work as it pertains to recovery and how that fits. And there's been a lot of reconciliation for me personally, and just the way that I present some of the work that I'm doing in the world publicly, to find a way to couch that not only makes sense to me, but can also make sense to other people that are in a similar situation as I, responsibly. And so it really is a very interesting time for me because I don't feel beholden to any particular program or anything like that. But at the same time, I'm still someone who absolutely chooses to abstain from certain mind-altering chemicals, and those would be the ones that are kind of my bottom line. And I continue to abstain from, or plan to continue to abstain from those for the rest of my life. But I also, I must be honest enough to acknowledge that so many of the sticking points in terms of healing the underlying issues of what eventually led to such abject addiction for me have been and continue to be healed and restored through the use of plant medicines and psychedelics. And so that puts me where I am now, which is really moving more into not that I'm moving out of the biohacking and all the things like that, because I really enjoy that, but it's kind of more of a novelty to see how finely tuned one's corporal meat suit can become. But the purpose of that really has always been and continues to be for me the process of spiritual evolution and self-realization. And so now I'm finding myself really drawn to doing some deeper work. And this week would be no exception, as I had an incredibly profound experience last Saturday with the bufo toad. And so as I sit here now, I'm just actually in awe of what my life has become as a result of all of the intuitive guidance that I've been able to follow over the past couple of years, especially, and capitalize on the foundation of spiritual principles that I built in all those years in recovery. So as I sit here now in this chat, it's really, really fascinating to observe the phenomena that is my current awakening. And I think with that is probably a pretty good summary of where I came from and where I find myself now.
That's such a fascinating, short, brief account. I really appreciate you sharing that with us, Luke. And you have such an interesting story. For anyone who is not familiar with your story, there was a great article that came out in Mind, Body, Green Health, and it's called How I Used Psychedelics to Support My Sobriety. Yes, you read that right. So anyone who's interested in learning more about this, we highly recommend you to check out that article. And I think there's this really interesting thing that you describe the meat suit and the spiritual pursuits as independent. And I think what's really interesting to hear you talk about this, and, in light of our past conversations, it's not just one or the other, right? It's where the meat suit and the spirit and the mind meet in the middle. And the balance is really the optimal health of us. And it's very hard to be spiritually awake or awakened and illuminated when our meat suit is not in good health, and same with our mind. And they all are in some ways dependent on each other. So it's a very interesting way to think about health. And so thank you for that. You're listening to The Psychedelic Report.
It sort of occurred to me, well, a couple different things. One is that it wasn't until after I had done a considerable amount of plant medicines in ceremony in a very intentional way and benefited greatly from those experiences that I realized that the initial sobriety that I had in 97, which is still ongoing, was really spurned by what I considered at the time to be a bad trip on mushrooms. I used to sell mushrooms as part of my vocation. And, there are plenty around. And one night I was just bored and drunk and took a bunch of mushrooms and had like a total meltdown. And then the crux of the meltdown was like, oh my God, I'm a crackhead. I'm a junkie. I'm an alcoholic. I am a complete fucking loser. And I'm going to die very soon if I don't stop. And then, woke up the next day and went back to business as usual. But it was a few months later that I think that experience and those insights that I had, even though that wasn't my intention that night, I was really trying to check out. But ultimately, the mushrooms checked me in to a truth that I could no longer ignore. So that's a really interesting subjective experience. And then looking historically at recovery in general and going back, as Dave was alluding to earlier, at the foundations of Alcoholics Anonymous, which to me is one of the most, if not the most influential and profound and prolific, widespread movements in the history of Western society. I mean, it's just, I think the magnitude of Alcoholics Anonymous as a teaching, as an organization is lost on many of us because it's ubiquitous and it's just kind of part of the fabric of our culture now. But if you really look back historically, in 1935, something extremely profound happened. What happened was that, Great Spirit dropped an idea in a couple guys' heads that if they talked to each other about their problems in a way that was honest and transparent and vulnerable, and they together learned how to apply fundamental spiritual principles to their lives and then carry that message to other people that suffered in that same capacity, that people could get well. And it really forged a very miraculous development that I've been riding the wave of for all of these years. But if you look back a little further, what had happened was, I just kind of realized this as I was putting together that article that you mentioned, was Bill Wilson, the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, was struck sober in a hospital in what they called a drying out ward, which would have been an early precursor to what we call a rehab or treatment center now. And one of the things they used to do to help alcoholics coming off alcohol with the DTs is give them all kinds of different sedative concoctions. And there was one such concoction that used a plant medicine called belladonna and a number of other sedatives. And under the influence of that belladonna sedative is when Bill Wilson had his infamous white light experience that rendered him sober from that moment until the day he died. Now, of course, he did other work to support his character change and relationship with God and the spirituality that had to follow. But it's really interesting that so many people in recovery circles are resistant of acknowledging that fact. And additionally, as Dave indicated earlier, later in life, when Bill Wilson was working with Aldous Huxley and different people, because he had access to really high level, thought leaders, I guess you could say at that time, experimented with LSD as a means by which to recreate the spiritual experience he had had on plant medicines in the treatment center in the hospital, right? And he thought, wow, we're applying these 12 steps, and the purpose of the 12 steps aren't to quit drinking. The purpose of the 12 steps are to have a spiritual experience and develop a relationship with God so that you are restored to sanity and relieved of the deadly obsession to drink alcohol, right? So my version of his exploration there is like, well, hey, maybe there's another way to have a spiritual experience even faster with less work by using LSD clinically. And so that's kind of the backstory on it. And that's my experience with it. And I think why some people have trouble with it, and I've not really gotten much backlash, but I'm also not, at this moment in my life, I wouldn't consider myself an active member of any particular recovery group. That would be troublesome to someone who still is, because what they're going to hear is like, oh, this guy's about to drink. And I have gotten that feedback a few times, but really the fundamental principles of recovery are just in the fabric of my being. And that might sound, cocksure, arrogant to someone, again, who's coming from that paradigm, but it's just the only way that I could get away from the integration of those principles that are how I live my life, I truly believe, is by drinking or, doing heroin, doing cocaine, doing some of those things that I used to do. I think that would disconnect me from the truth of who I am very quickly, and also disconnect me from the higher power that I've built such a beautiful and trusting and loving relationship over the past 24 years. And so in my own experience, when I decided to take ayahuasca at 22 years sober, I really had to deeply go inward and reconcile what sobriety meant to me, how I was going to define that. If I was then going to consider myself sober, do I say I'm 22 years sober still, or am I not? Like, there was a lot of semantics, maybe is the word I'm looking for, that I had to just wrestle with, and I've done podcasts on this. I do a lot of immersive journalism where I go have an experience and kind of do live real-time podcasting about it. One story I like to tell is, in terms of like, what is our definition of sobriety? I really spent a lot of years researching all of the words used in the recovery programs. I mean, just dissecting them. What do they really mean? And one word that I spent a lot of time really researching and integrating is the word sober. And if you look up the word sober, the primary definition is soundness of mind. It has to do with being sane. Right. And so when that first cup of, or I guess technically it was the second cup of ayahuasca hit me, and I was overtaken in such a beautifully profound way by that medicine, I remember having very clearly the realization that I had never been this sober in my entire life. Meaning I had never been so free of the confines of the structure of personality and all of its constituents, egoic mind, chattering mind, sensations in the body, etc. It was as close to non-duality as I had ever been, period. Now, having done Bufo a few times, I have a totally different definition of non-duality, because in ayahuasca, there's still a witness and there's still a participant in the experience. But anyway, that's a whole other topic. But to try and wrap a bow that's cohesive on this recovery piece and how this fits in for me, which I'm still navigating, by the way, like I would never claim to have this piece figured out, but it is very interesting to me to unpack it and watch how it's unfolding. And in that moment, when I had that realization, it was so freeing because I was able to really surrender all of the confines that I had wisely placed on myself in terms of complete 100% abstinence from all mind-altering chemicals for 22 years. And in that moment, I became free of any label, of any counting of time, even though I do still count time because I'm so grateful to God for the salvation that I've been graced with. So it's meaningful to me, but it's not meaningful in terms of I'm going to hold my hand up in a meeting and be like, I've got 24 years, like that badge of honor. But it was just like, wow, I think the realization was I can trust myself. I know what I'm doing here. Mm-hmm. I'm okay. I'm safe. I don't have to worry about self-delusion and thinking I can leave this Costa Rican retreat and go have a couple beers next week. Like there was just no delusion because I was in such a place of grace and true sanity in the depth of that medicine that if it did anything, it made me more committed to abstinence from what I consider to be, at least in my own experience, destructive molecules. I mean, you could just break it down to that. So it's like there's a certain set of molecules that I'm willing to interact with, and there's a certain set that I'm not. And that's my own sovereignty as a living, breathing man. And I'm free to make those decisions. And I'm also willing to accept whatever benefit or consequences might come with my openness to these experiences. And to close is I have had to pump the brakes a couple of times. And Dave knows this because we were scheduled for a series of ketamine assisted therapy sessions. And it's not like I was going to start doing drugs or drinking or something, but I think I became a little bit enamored with, if not attached to, some of these peak experiences, not because I sought them as a means by which to escape from my reality, but because every time I've had a ceremonial experience or a therapeutic experience, I've just covered so much ground. I'm so productive. That's how I describe all of my medicine journeys. I'm just like, holy shit, I got that much done in 5 hours. I mean, the last mushroom ceremony I did, I swear to God, it's like 30 years of therapy. I was touching on things that I had no concept even existed in my reality that could be looked at or healed or observed and integrated. I mean, it's just unreal. So with that, it's like, I'm all about this evolution, and my commitment really is to enlightenment and self-realization. And so at a certain point, I was getting pretty regular and perhaps a little overzealous and maybe even not as mindful about the integration that's really needed with some of these profound experiences. So I took a break for a few months, and it was the best thing I could have ever done. And that break could have lasted forever. Who knows? But I felt the call again, and I felt the call many times since. And the call has always been one that was valid and useful for that particular time. So
one that was intentional, right?
Very much so. Yeah. And, thankfully I have a beautiful fiance who's a shaman and is very tapped in, and we feel into things together. She's not a shaman who particularly works with medicine, although she has in her own experience. But, having people around, I think, that can throw in a checkmate if I'm getting a little squirrely is very helpful. But more and more, I'm learning how to trust myself and really check my motives. And that's something that comes out of a foundation of recovery. The number one thing you got to do when you want to get sober is you have to be honest with yourself. That's step one, is get real, get honest with yourself. And this is where it gets tricky. It's like, see, I don't recommend what I'm doing for people in recovery. That would be very irresponsible. And I'm not willing to take on the karmic debt that could incur by saying this is the way people should go. I'm just saying this is the way I'm going. And I think it's worth looking at in a responsible, conscious, open-hearted and open-minded way. And people in recovery that really fight against this, I see the wisdom in the historical reference of complete abstinence. But then again, if you go back, well, was Bill Wilson, the guy that we all kind of look to in these circles, was he completely abstinent? Not really, not in terms of psychedelics. Maybe he was abstinent from alcohol and whatever else, but it's a very nuanced conversation. It's a very nuanced path. And anytime I talk about this, I preface it by saying, hey, you got to find your own path with this if you're someone in recovery. But I don't think that it can be negated, because it has completely revolutionized my entire life. I mean, it's just unreal. If you knew me 2.5 years ago compared to how I am and who I am now, I'm a completely different person. I've matured decades, emotionally, spiritually, mentally in 2 years because of all of the work that I've been able to do with the assistance of some amazing guides and shaman and facilitators and medicine and discernment. And more than anything, that foundation of spiritual principles and a fundamental understanding psychologically of what I'm doing in those medicine spaces. I'm not in there to just see entities and colors and have a good time, although I don't think there's anything wrong with that if that's one's path. But I'm so clear on the purpose every time I go in. And as a result, I think spirit delivers me the results of my intention, because for some reason I've been able to, in most cases, very fearlessly walk through those portals and go into some depths that I don't know how else I could get to. I just don't see how I could get to where I've gone, just sitting there meditating, doing my Kundalini yoga, doing all the things I did for years. But those things I did for years created a foundation where I think I can handle some pretty potent experiences without falling apart. And I'm able to reintegrate, which is what's going on this week in the most bizarre and beautiful way.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Luke. And I think it's really interesting to think about, right? Because what you're talking about is that these spiritual experiences for many decades have been this experience of what you described earlier, using a very important word, which is awe, right? It's this idea of having an experience or a series of experiences that we feel are somewhat intentional, meaning we took the time to plan out, to put our energy into something to get a certain outcome. And it cultivates a certain degree of awe naturally for us that lasts after the medicine has worn off. And sometimes for days, sometimes for months, sometimes for years afterwards, people can have that persistent awe, which of course requires integration, requires some work afterwards. But this is a really interesting concept. And I want everybody to understand that as physicians, none of us are by any means advocating that if you are struggling with substance abuse, that you go and start taking mushrooms all the time or sign up for your next ayahuasca ceremony. Everybody needs to find their own path. But I think what's really fascinating is these medicines have had very substantial evidence, and not just one or a couple, but many psychedelic medicines from LSD, ibogaine, MDMA, psilocybin have had a wealth of evidence over the last 70 years, or maybe a little more now, showing that they have enough evidence to warrant investigating the use of these medicines for addiction, which is really fascinating. And so there are ways for people to participate in these trials and to have access to these medicines for addiction. And we definitely recommend that anybody who's interested in that, please, reach out to us. But I think going back to this idea of cultivating awe, we'd be remiss if we did not talk about this idea of cultivating awe, and that there are certain substances, medicines, like psychedelic medicines, even cannabis, that when used in a very intentional and ceremonial even way, that they are fairly reliable at cultivating awe. Whereas there are other medicines, and again, this is important to understand because not all medicines are created equal. There are other medicines like alcohol, sedatives, benzodiazepines, opioid narcotics, and natural opioids, and then stimulants like methamphetamine and things of that nature that are not as good at cultivating awe. And then the intention with which we use a medicine going into the experience is also extremely important. And I'm wondering, Luke, if you could talk a little bit about that, because that's really what Bill was doing when he had that experience with belladonna and the experiences with LSD. He was trying to create a repeatable, safe method for cultivating awe, because that sense of naturally cultivated awe that persists afterwards is really what sustains our life force, and it sustains our connection to source. And as you said, not just building a sense of connection to God or higher power, but really building a stronger connection to ourselves. And that connection to ourselves is what you described as trust, which is what we often focus on the 4 pillars for: self-gratitude, self-forgiveness, self-compassion, and self-love. And the 4 agreements, which are, many of you know, do not make expectations, always do your best, don't take anything personally, and always be true to your word. And so, Luke, could you talk briefly just a little bit about the idea of cultivating awe and how that's played a role in recovery, restoring balance for you, for others you've known, and about how not all drugs and not all intentions are created equal?
Yeah, absolutely. That's, I left out word awe because I'm sitting in my room right now and I'm just in awe at everything I see around me. And I've had no mind-altering substances at all today. But I do have a lingering sense of awe that is quite profound at the moment. But, I think what's happening with the different chemicals that you mentioned and the ones that I'm referring to as being beneficial, it's like they're all tools, right? And depending on what your goal is, all of those tools may or may not have a place in your life. So, for example, something like a benzo or opiate or alcohol or something at this point in my life, those tools would not be applicable in most cases. I mean, sometimes I take kratom or something if my back hurts. So I guess a tool like that has some utility. But in terms of consciousness, none of those tools have anything to offer me at this point in my life, because what those tools would be used for, in my case, would be to become disconnected from consciousness, disconnected from my body, disconnected from my mind, to actually disintegrate who and what I am, because who and what I am as I'm experiencing it in the moment is so uncomfortable, if not abjectly painful. So if one is in dire emotional pain and the only way out is to drink half a bottle of whiskey, I mean, that can be a great tool, you know what I mean? If there's no other way out. But it's not going to create, as you so wisely indicated, a sense of awe or that sense that, wow, there's more to this game than I thought.
And you're often going to feel a hell of a lot worse the next day.
Correct. Absolutely. Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, it's like, are there side effects? I was thinking about this the other day after Bufo, and I was thinking, God, I'm just going to go eat a burger. I feel amazing, and I was like, God, this is a totally different experience than doing ayahuasca, for example, where there's such a physical toll. But for me, the physical toll has been, at least up until now, always worth the benefit. But in terms of that sense of awe, I think that oh, there's so much to that. It's a connection to the whole of consciousness and finding your place in it. And going back even further than my one ill-fated mushroom trip. I mean, I remember the first time I took LSD when I was like 18 years old and just completely in the throes of addiction with cocaine and alcohol and all kinds of stuff. But even in the midst of that, I remember having one night this sense of awe at just how minuscule and insignificant I was as I looked up at the sky. And that one single realization has stayed with me my entire life. So that particular substance had the ability to open up this portal of awe and open me up into a realm of reality that was profoundly moving, even though at that point in my journey, that tool was not the tool that I needed. The tool I needed was to just numb and just shut down the noise because I had no other tools at my avail. And so
that you knew of or knew how to use, right, at that time.
Yeah, correct. I mean, there
Right.
were tools. I just didn't know what they were. And frankly, if you would have handed them to me, I probably wouldn't have taken them because of the cocksuredness of being a little arrogant, egoically driven 18-year-old male in the 80s. You know what I mean? So if you would have said, hey, have you tried meditation? I'd be like, what, just sit there? Are you crazy? But anyway, in terms of the uses and the utility of these different substances and where they come in life, I mean, I've never been someone who's for abolition and thinks that, nobody should drink and no one should smoke cigarettes and do drugs. Like, I'm 100% live and let live. It's just subjectively, I find that what I'm looking for in my experiences are ways to more deeply connect to spirit and also to really heal the underlying trauma, which I think I've dug through a lot of that stuff through the excavation in the last couple of years. And even before that, just much more slowly. So that now it's not that like I don't drink alcohol because I'm afraid of it. I don't drink alcohol because I don't need to, because there's nothing wrong. That key does not fit the lock because it's a different lock now.
It's not serving you now.
Yeah, so many of the underlying issues and, past experiences from childhood and all of the, self-abuse and self-torture and also the victimization at the hands of perpetrators throughout my life. And all of that stuff has been, pretty thoroughly cleaned out. So now it's not like, oh, I need to go in and do this deep work in medicine. It's more about that awe. It's about, wow, how can I create an even more rich experience with the creator, with God, with source? How can I get into that field of allness that's past the void and do some serious work, like the real work, not the clearing out the wreckage work, but the evolutionary self-realization work. And that work can obviously be done without these substances because all of the great mystics and saints and sages that many of us have learned from over the ages seem to have done it on their own with the assistance of grace, right? But that's my angle now. And that's where these tools find their validity and value. And who knows, maybe in a year, I'll be like, that was a phase I learned and I'm good and I never do it again. I don't know, but every experience I have, I just go, oh my God, like I can't imagine what would have happened if I lived my life and didn't have this experience I just had. Like it would have been a much more shallow experience. And I think it would have been so much more slow going to become fully realized and integrated as a spirit running around in a body. Everything is dramatically recontextualized every time I go on a journey in some way or another. And most recently, quite profoundly, a most ineffable way, So yeah, that's my take on that.
You're listening to The Psychedelic Report.
In the past, I guess it's been about 3 weeks or so, I've experienced 5 Bufo journeys. I don't not recommend that because it hasn't served me. I just don't recommend that because it could go terribly wrong for a person if it was the wrong place and the wrong time and they weren't ready for that. But I'm on the eve, and I guess 3 weeks from now or so of moving my entire life, dog, cat, fiance, business from LA after 32 years here to Austin, Texas. Now that was already in the works before those experiences, but man, it is a wild ride kind of learning how to come back into my personality, back into my body, back into I'm just a different person than I was just a few short weeks ago. So it really is very interesting right now, making some big 3D moves when I'm not totally 3D yet. And I don't know that I ever will be actually. So yeah, I think what I'm learning is the self-awareness of really being so loving and gentle with oneself and all of the aspects of self, including the body, mentality, reintegrating, your ego in a way that is allowing it to come find a home in a new structure. There's a new blueprint, and the building is kind of has this new foundation, and it's being built, and the personality is sort of finding its way back into who I am. And it takes a lot of reverence and stillness to allow that to happen in a way that is smooth. And so talking about big changes, I mean, a few days ago, I had to just kind of walk around and sweep up a little bit and just do the most mundane things to learn how to just be a person again, as weird as that might sound. And I'm still kind of in that. So the integration, I think, depending on the depth of experience and also the medicine one is using, is so critical. For this reason, perhaps some people that aren't schooled on that or really honor that tradition and the importance of that might get kind of spun out. And I'm assuming this is where the psychotic breaks and some of the kind of negative experiences you hear from people, because I can see now, if I didn't have such a understanding and wise, loving partner that was here to hold space for me and just kind of go, you're still here. You're okay. I don't know. It could be a different experience. And just also really tuning into my body. Like, for example, I normally do at least 1, if not 2 to 3 ice baths per day. It's what I do. I love ice baths. And since last Saturday, I've taken a couple and my body's like, I don't like this. And so rather than me just egoically pushing through that and be like, but it's good for you, body, I've had to go, hey, I'm very sensitive and fragile right now at the moment, and I'm just going to honor that. And I take meditation breaks constantly throughout the day. I meditate every morning for an hour and a half. I'm just really having to take my time so that I can squeeze all of the juice out of that experience and not rush back into being a 3D finite being again, because I elect to continue to be a finite physical 3D being, but I really want to savor the new perspective that I gained in those experiences and integrate them truly, meaning like have integrity where I become whole again without discounting or discarding those realizations and this new level of awareness and beingness. But I also have to honor that I have to pay taxes and have bills and a dog, and, I'm moving and I have to book movers and packing and all of this stuff at once. So it is a real dance, I think. And in general, I would advise, if somebody has a really profound experience, man, just take all the time you can to truly integrate and make sure that you have support from facilitators and people that have an understanding of what you're going through. I don't think right now I could call on someone who wasn't quite evolved or someone who had experience with that particular medicine and get any sort of grounding advice from them, because there's no point of reference that they could arrive at that would make sense to me, because the experience was so profoundly altering. I think where the caution is in all of these type of explorations really is, it's not even so much in the doing it at times. It's like, what are you doing after, right? And are you really deeply committed to self-care and honoring whatever your entire being needs to become whole again? Because in a sense, when you're having this temporary detachment, or at least a lessening of the egoic self and the intellect, and you're really tapping into super consciousness, and then you come back and you're totally in your body again, that doesn't just happen naturally. I think it really requires some fortitude and some assistance to be able to do so safely, so that you come back a more whole version rather than a fragmented version of who you were before you went in.
Right. Such wise words. I think what I hear you saying to a large extent is that your work, independent of the medicines, the groundwork, the foundational work you've been doing for years, and also the work with the medicines, has facilitated this deeper connection to your intuition, to your own personal inner healing intelligence that is guiding us and telling us what to do, as in the MAPS lingo. And I think what's really interesting is that whether we look at this from a Western perspective, from a Western psychiatrist working with MDMA or ketamine or psilocybin, or whether we're looking at this from a tribal ceremonial perspective, what we see is experiences that are meaningful to us happening sometime in our lives that are perceived as negative or unpleasant to us, that we then call trauma, blocks us from accessing our whole self. And if that trauma is unprocessed, meaning that we haven't sorted through it and thought about it when it asks us to figure out, how do we understand the role that this plays in our lives? How do we understand what we can learn from these experiences? When we don't address it, when we don't process it, that's when the biggest blockages in our energetic flow or our access to our full potential really occur. And so whether you're in tribal medicine or Western medicine, a lot of the practice that we do, whether we're using psychedelic medicines or not, is to help process some of this unprocessed, call it traumatic or negative, meaningful material, so that we can allow your essence to flow freely so that the trauma isn't blocking you or us from listening to ourselves. And once we start to remove some of those blockers, it becomes pretty clear what our bodies need, what our minds need, and what our spirits need. And we become open to that and able to help more effectively. And I think what's really interesting is this idea that we talk about all the time in trauma treatment, but also in depression, also in people who have bad trips, also in people who don't have a diagnosis. That's exquisitely common, is this idea of unprocessed negative experiences cause these, what we call like rumination, right? Or brooding, negative thought loops about ourselves that don't really go anywhere. Like, why is this happening to me? What is so wrong with me that my life is like this and everybody else's life is like that? What am I doing wrong? What is happening in my life that makes me not as good as everybody else, right? Why can't I do it? And that internal narrative of those negative intrusive thoughts that many of us have, if not all of us, at some point in our lives that we often don't think about or learn how to deal with, is something really interesting that psychedelic medicines really help with. They disrupt those negative thought loops and help people understand that there's a new way to think, and this old way of thinking might not be serving them. Luke, would you mind talking about that a little bit and maybe telling us if that's something that you've experienced or has that played a role in your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as someone who had been meditating pretty consistently for 20 years or so before I ever did, as I indicated earlier, LSD and mushrooms and stuff when I was a kid quite a bit, just as an attempt to escape, which never really worked out, by the way. I always tell people, if you're looking for an escape, psychedelics are a horrible decision. If you're looking for an inscape, could be great. But, I'd been meditating for a long time, and I made a lot of progress in fortifying the capacity to stay in that witness observer perspective more of the time, right? So in the beginning of the journey of meditating and just having some self-awareness, being watchful of my thoughts, being mindful of an emotion, seeing how perhaps I felt an emotion that I couldn't identify. And then I would start, as you said, to ruminate about it and build a story around it. And all of these sort of constructs started to be dismantled through just basic fundamental meditation. In the beginning, I don't think I could meditate for a few years. So there was guided meditations. And then eventually I learned how to do Vedic meditation and, float tanks and years of Kundalini yoga and all this, where I started to clearly understand that there's me as consciousness observing the phenomenon of thought, feeling, sensation, physicality, all of that, right? But the trick was, and continues to be, I guess, in how deeply in that state of awareness and observation can I remain when I'm out in beta brainwaves, like doing shit and living life. And, I don't have time to sit there and observe, ooh, this is interesting. Here comes a little thought floating by. It's like when you're in traffic and, there's no time delay there to find that gap, right? So over the years, just ever so slowly, just continuing to work at it, that gap of awareness between the true self with the capital S, I guess you could say, and the reactionary pain body, small s self, ego that's having trouble being in its skin, those gaps got bigger. But with the introduction of the experiences that we're covering today, I mean, it's a whole different level of observation. It's like, oh shit, we're zooming way out, right? But now that witness observer is able to meander and navigate through all of these different interdimensional portals and really get a much more broad perspective of self. And in that, I think, is where the real value in having meditative practices and mindfulness practices, so that when you come out of a peak experience, you can actually capitalize on the new level of awareness that one has gained, to where now, to further establish and perpetuate those longer gaps becomes easier, even when life is kind of coming at you a bit faster and you're active and very much in the 3D waking state. But now you've grasped, as you mentioned earlier, that awe of like, oh, wow, there's so much more going on here. And in that, there's a bit less seriousness and attachment to the constructs of the mind and its various opinions and constructs and limitations. And there's much less attachment to and seriousness about emotions as they might arise. I mean, this week I just stop and stare at Allison's face for a minute and I just start bawling. And I just let myself stay there and just experience that. And then I just walk away. Bye, honey, as an example of just, wow, okay, I'm really present to this experience of being Luke Story for this moment that I'm here. And that is like this incredible depth of richness in that perspective of not detaching from life, but rather fully engaging in life in all of the expressions of mind and personality and ego, but also, and at the very same time, in a synchronistic way, being completely zoomed out in a very broad perspective. And to me, this is really the sweet spot. I mean, this is where life gets really interesting because then you're here, but you're not here. You know what I mean? It's like you're kind of watching the personality do what it does and you're watching the body do what it does and really loving the opportunity to do so, right? Because one can realize that, at least in my experience, I've chosen to be here at this time being this person. So rather than negating my personality and the fact that even after a bunch of bufo ceremonies, I still bite the shit out of my fingernails, I thought maybe I'll be cured of that. It's like, no, I still have some of the minor neuroses and probably some of the major ones too from time to time, but there's less drama about it. It's really just kind of a fun thing to participate in and witness at the same time. It's like, I don't know. I find myself just looking at what's going on in the world and the external now. And I mean, have a really, what I experience as a very healthy non-attachment to the projection of the matrix, the simulation that we see. I mean, it's like, I'm not negating it as part of my experience, but I'm also much less attached to it. It's kind of like being in the world and not of the world. And so some of these brief sojourns where you are completely not of the world, I think are very useful because when you come back and provided you have the right support and integration tools and a framework to build on, then that gets easier and easier and life and reality itself gets malleable and a bit more fun. It's just like less serious. That's what I'm experiencing. It's just like, I don't know, the things that I used to worry about, I don't worry about. And then I'll catch my mind going, Luke, you should probably be worrying about this. And I observe that and go, that's really funny. How about not? How about I just don't worry about it?
Right.
I'm going on a trip to Mexico next week to do some work there. And, there's all of these strange COVID things that I'm not in alignment with at all. And, I would tend to be worried about what that experience is going to look like. And I don't know, somehow I'm just like, it'll be fine, whatever. We go, we don't go, we go and we do the thing, we go and we don't do the thing. It's just kind of, it doesn't matter. I'm just like, what's happening right now? Right now, I'm talking to Dave. Like, that's the only thing I really need to put any attention or effort on in this moment. And then when this is over, there'll be another thing, feed the dog, kiss the wife's knee, and then you just keep it moving. It's a really fluid, beautiful flow state way of experiencing the short period in which we're here. And I can't help but think and believe somehow intuitively that these awarenesses that we're able to learn how to cultivate really have to do with some stage of soul evolution and soul mastery. And perhaps if and when a guy like me chooses to come back here, there will be a different experience in learning that is perhaps devoid of so much of the suffering that it took this time to get me to finally surrender to the big picture and to really trust in the purpose of duality and to really embrace that experience in all its forms. And that's why I can look at something like the politics right now and just go, this is fun. It's just like, it's also ridiculous. It's like, why even spend any time and energy worrying about it? It's all, God made it all like this as a play to experience itself in all its different spectrums energetically and karmically. And it's all just like this soup that we get to kind of swim around in and hopefully do so consciously and uplift as many other souls with us while we're here.
You're listening to The Psychedelic Report.
So just to create some context, and again, hard preface here, I would not advise this path for others indiscriminately, but as it happened to be this past Saturday, I went to not to participate in a Bufo toad ceremony, but rather to support and hold space for four of my friends that felt called to have the experience. In so doing, as a space holder, the plan was to just take, perhaps with each person, what's referred to as a meditation dose. I don't know how that is quantified at this point. I certainly don't know how, but it's, a small inhale of the smoke. And then, you're allowed to really be in that space to a much lesser degree, I think is the idea. And what ended up happening, though, incidentally, is it's now revealed as a divinely orchestrated event, is that I ended up having 4 complete journeys that day, full blown. So as alarming as it was the first day after, when I woke up and kind of had it was a bit jarring, because I didn't know, the mind had no way to know how to come back in to the experience. And so the mind started going, what if you're nuts now? Are you having a psychotic break? Did you push it too far? Did someone not know what they were doing and not warn you? Did you fuck this up and now you're not here anymore? Thankfully, as I said earlier, my lovely partner was here, and I was afraid she was going to freak out because I fucked myself up. You know what I mean? And I was like, hey, I got to talk to you. And we had a really beautiful moment. And she just so powerfully, God, just held me there in that space. And she got what was happening in a way that I couldn't even understand at that point. And she said, oh, I know exactly what's happening here. You're good. And then, I don't know, for some reason with that, I was able to really surrender into it and then ride the waves. But on the other side of that, I think in terms of the duality, and when we have these experiences in them, everything starts to click and kind of make sense, as chaotic and disjointed as it might be sometimes, as these medicines take you through these portals. There is a sense that like, oh, okay, there is a deeper meaning to this. There's something that created and orchestrated all this. There is a connection to the source of consciousness and the realization that the world that we experience through our senses is intentional and there with purpose and for purpose. And so to come back into the human experience after having something so profound happen like that, I think the main underlying benefit is really a huge decrease in the fear of death, right? And ultimately, in my life, I think most of my problems that have been self-created, and probably even some of the things that have been perpetuated by others, just come out of the base nature of survival and the body wanting to stay alive as its animal being, the ego being this personality structure whose job it is to make sure that the body sticks around, the master supercomputer prefrontal cortex that's up there going, okay, ego, tell me what to do and I'll devise a plan. All of this that we're experiencing that makes life so confusing and sometimes painful and frustrating starts to get dismantled when we're able to see that the whole thing is by design. And I think what differentiates the 5-MeO DMT Bufo experience is that, unlike all the other medicines that I've ever experienced, for some period of time in this one, there is no witness or experiencer participating in the event. There's not like, oh, this is interesting. I'm watching my thoughts go by. Oh, I'm going to go down this portal. I just saw one of my angel guides. We're going to go work on this or that. It's just so aptly described in the way that you did. It's every sensation, every feeling, every experience that you ever have, will experience all at once, as high as it goes. And that's why this particular one for me, it is terrifying, but it's also, there's like something in me that's like, I need to know if there's more. And there is, it turns out. And the more is that there's everything. And in this particular medicine space, there is no experiencer or witness of the experience when you're in the depth of it. And there's no differentiation of duality, of this feels good, this feels bad. It's just unicity, it's oneness, it's everything all the time, all at once. And so in that space, there's really nothing to be afraid of because there's no you there to be afraid of it. And in terms of unpacking the duality and me coming back and going, wow, I really don't care about like what's happening politically in the world. It's all just theater. is that I really got the sense, especially the one I did 3 weeks ago, which ended up like I had a bad trip in the middle of a really beautiful trip, which we probably don't have time to talk about on this one. But it was so clear to me that God, source, consciousness itself, because it's only one thing and there's no single point of consciousness or awareness in that, had to, at some point in like a big bang kind of way, differentiate itself into duality and all of the form that we experience in a body. And so even though there was no you there or no me there to actually experience that or contextualize it, yet at the same time, what's so fascinating is as the intensity of that medicine subsides and the you starts to reemerge, the you still knows that you were there, even though you weren't there. And this is probably making no sense to someone that has not had this experience. This is an ineffable thing, but you can't help but try and unpack it, because I really feel that it's really solving the mystery of the universe, And in that, I can come back and go, oh my God, I totally get why there's rapists and pedophiles and wars and murderers and famine. And it's all by design.
Well, very well said. I really appreciate that. These are really complicated topics to understand. And for those who are not familiar with the terms duality and non-duality, duality is very simply understood as what we perceive on a day-to-day basis for most of us, which is a separation between self and non-self or other, a separation between good and bad, a separation between here and there, you and I, fear and love. These separations coexist in every moment in all of our lives, which is the duality of experience that Luke was talking about. And interestingly, simultaneously with that duality, there is a coexisting non-duality or singularity, which is the fundamental understanding that everything is actually, while appearing to be different to our minds, oftentimes, everything is actually intimately connected. And it's all part of the same experience, and it's all part of consciousness, regardless of how separate or different these things seem to be. And so the happy middle ground in all of this is this constant striving to find that middle ground where our minds and our bodies and our spirits can get to a point where duality and non-duality can coexist together. The understanding of both self and other and all of us being one can actually exist at the same time, which is true. That's actually what's happening in consciousness, which is really quite fascinating.
Thank you for holding space and allowing me to process. It's really actually incredible to do so in this way. And it's such a special thing to share with, whoever ends up hearing it too. It's a rarefied experience, to say the least, and even more rare to want enlightenment. And the rarest of all is to achieve it. So if we're somewhere on that journey, we're winning. Thank you so much. It's really great to have this chat. This has been so meaningful and special for me. And I just thank you guys so much for the invitation. And I can't wait to talk again.
Thanks for listening to The Psychedelic Report. Visit us at thepsychedelicreport.com. This show is recorded weekly on Clubhouse with a live audience. The Psychedelic Report was brought to you by Apollo Neuroscience and produced by Future Medicine Media. While I am a doctor, I'm not your doctor. So please don't take anything you hear on the Psychedelic Report as personal medical advice, because we don't know you. If you have questions about anything you hear on this show, please consult with your doctor.